Well, welcome back. This is our third and final installment in our trilogy of a rational thinker's way of navigating through climate change and all the policies tied to it, whether they're climate policies or energy policies. And in this installment, I want to talk a little bit about what the real or the true driver is behind these policies that when you think them through from a chemistry or a physics or a math or an economics perspective, they make absolutely no sense. And there's two different ways to approach this because there's two different sort of stakeholders that are going to benefit from this. One more external with respect to places like the United States and one a little more internal. But let's start with the external stakeholders. If you take a look at the adversaries that are out there to Republican democracies all over the world, they are largely, if not exclusively, leftist in nature, and that can be communist or socialist or authoritarian or some combination often of two or three of those. And they're all benefiting, ironically, from our own energy and climate policies. They're benefiting greatly on an unprecedented scale. So just a quick sort of walk through that map, which we touched upon in our second installment. OPEC is a great example of this. OPEC was left for dead, basically, with the advent of the American shale revolution that the private sector and free enterprise and innovation and disruptive technology brought to bear. But then came these climate policies and energy policies that are looking effectively to ban or to mandate the walking away from domestic energy sources like natural gas. Well, that plays right into an entity like OPEC's hands, and a couple of different ways it does that. One, it is the necessary sort of filling of that energy equation. It needs to be satisfied. So if you're hoping that wind and solar are going to be able to provide our electricity needs and electric vehicles are going to be able to provide an economy's way of transporting people and products to and from, you're sadly mistaken. And as Europe has learned, you'll need something, whether it's Russian natural gas or the rest of the world will need something like OPEC oil to make those energy balances work. And OPEC is once again exerting its control and acting in its own self-interest. But again, we've given it that control through our climate and energy policies. Russia, I mentioned Russia, that's perhaps exhibit A in these negative consequences and the true drivers of these climate and energy policies. It's been well established that Russian interests, whether they were Russian companies or Russian actors, had been huge funders and supporters behind the scenes of the ban fracking movement, and I'm sure they're applauding the net zero and the code red crowd on day by day and policy by policy. And Europe is no better example to see why Russia would want that. That gives them leverage, it emboldens them, and it makes them much more likely to invade countries like the Ukraine. And maybe not stop there, just ask the entities that are leading governments all across Eastern Europe how they're feeling these days with respect to Russia. Energy policy, climate policy is the single biggest enabler that made all of those negative things come true with respect to what's going on in Eastern Europe. Venezuela, we talked about that in episode number 2, but Venezuela is a really interesting one to me. That nation went from effectively a pariah and under heavy sanction from the United States to one now where not only sanctions are easing, but we're off with our leaders to try to ask forgiveness to the leaders of Venezuela so that they would produce more oil or sell more oil throughout the global markets to try to tamp down energy volatility and chaotic energy markets. And now Venezuela knows and senses that we need it. So what does it do? It starts to get much more aggressive towards its neighbor in Guyana because Guyana holds significant oil reserves and Venezuela wants to be able to control those reserves moving forward. And then there's China. You know, maybe not the most timely today when you've got someone like Russia to talk about or a pending invasion from Venezuela, but China clearly the biggest single example of who benefits the most with respect to climate policies and net zero journeys to really bad places. China, by design, has structured its economy and made its investments across the globe to put a stranglehold around every imaginable supply chain component of wind, solar, EVs, and batteries. And to think for a minute that we're going to be able in Europe or the United States or North America to mine enough, process enough, manufacture enough of this stuff that's needed for a net zero plan when it comes to wind, solar, and EVs. That's a ridiculous set of assumptions. What we're going to do is we're going to trade our energy independence not long ago with respect to things like natural gas and domestic oil and our grid, and we're going to exchange that for an energy dependency on none other than China. That's, of course, not going to be a good thing. So you see these examples sort of from an external perspective of leftist regimes all over the planet. And not only are they big beneficiaries of sort of climate policies and net zero paths, I believe in many ways they're trying to incite those as best they can. But then there's a second perspective that needs to be looked at with respect to what's behind all of this. And it's more ideological than anything else. And it is the left within sort of the West itself, whether it's the United States or Europe. And the left, at the end of the day, more than anything, despises the individual, and specifically the freedom of the individual to choose for themselves. The left is always looking to tear away that freedom, to tear away that freedom of choice of the individual, and then once torn away, to then place that decision-making, that power, so to speak, in the hands of a higher authority. Now, that higher authority could be a religion, that higher authority could be the state, or sometimes a combination of the two. As we said, a lot of these climate policies and the climate alarmist crowd, it is indeed a religion. But once you look at what the left is ultimately after, what better way to achieve those means than through controlling energy markets in the energy industry? So if you wanted to only control one industry out there, one sector of the economy, you only pick one, and you wanted to do that in a way to control everything else, which sector, which industry would you choose? Well, you can make an argument to go after something like healthcare, or maybe finance, or maybe tech these days, specifically with things like AI, social media. But if you only gave me one industry to choose, I would always choose energy, because the kilowatt hour and the BTU, they touch everything in a modern economy. All those other industries I just mentioned, and then all the other industries that remain. And if you control the kilowatt hour, the BTU, now you can start to control decision making. And what you're going to quickly learn or come to conclude is that these climate policies, they're not about atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, anything but. It's not about the weather or future weather, anything but. What it's about is decision making and control. So you should start to see climate policies bleeding into things beyond the generation grid. And you're starting to see that, aren't you? When it comes to even things like food. What you can eat or what you should eat is currently being questioned by everyone from environmental advocates on the radical environmental movement front to the United Nations and everybody in between, and are starting to look at the carbon footprints of certain foods being red meat, so your hamburger, right? Certain foods being ice cream, which carries a significant carbon footprint, and significant foods like beer. So if you like beer, ice cream, or hamburgers, got some bad news that might be coming your way down the road if these climate policies continue on their inevitable march toward individual rights and individual control. Driving's another great example. What better expression of personal freedom is there than the personal automobile, right? It's revolutionized things across all kinds of different societies and periods of time. Well, through EV mandates, if you think through the grid and when and if you can charge or when you're allowed to charge your electric vehicle, that's another way of exerting control. The concept of 15-minute cities, I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but look that up. The 15-minute city concept is basically all of this rolled into one, where there's a movement out there where policy should incentivize forcing upon controlling individuals to live not just in urban areas, but within so many minutes walking distance of public transportation, because that would be the only mode of transportation that would be acceptable, and basically living in certain sized apartment complexes versus larger sized homes, and again, being told what they can do and when they can do it. We've also seen sort of climate policies start to rear their head and bleed into the issue of emergency powers, right? It's a climate emergency day or a grid emergency day. We just saw one of those recently in California. So when the weather gets hot or the weather gets cold on the extreme sides, don't charge your electric vehicle today because we've got a grid emergency or we have a climate emergency. Basically saying you're shut down. Don't run your business. We're shut down. And we've had sort of a wide array of experiences with that coming off a pandemic, but that could be something that is permanent with respect to these climate policies. Yeah, you start adding all this up, what do you got? You got a situation where the individual loses control over their own decision making. And then in its place, they're told, trust in a higher authority. The government or the state or whatever the expert is, they'll take care of you. They'll tell you what to do. And we know through hundreds of years of history how that typically turns out when that's the left that's in control. Now, I said many times that this is akin to, feels a lot like a religion. I'm Catholic. You don't have to look any further than what's going on at the Vatican to sort of prove that point. Pope Francis, and comparing him to somebody like Pope John Paul II, boy, what a contrast, right? But with Pope Francis, in many ways, his policies, they're not necessarily instituting Catholic norms or doctrine upon the flock. They're instituting socialist norms or doctrine upon the flock. And the biggest tactical tool in his toolbox to do that is with respect to environmental policies, environmental beliefs, and climate change issues, climate change policies. In many ways, it sort of reminds me, whether it's what's going on with the Vatican or whether what's going on with just policies in the United States and Europe on the climate front, reminds me of the practice of the Catholic Church hundreds of years ago that was known as indulgences. And what an indulgence was, it said that if you had enough money and you committed some sort of sin, whatever the sin was that the church said was sinful, you could basically buy your way out of it. You paid an indulgence and it wiped away the sin. So it was a basically get out of hell, I guess, for free, but not for free, for a fee type of an approach. Looked down upon greatly, sort of led to the Protestant Reformation because people said enough is enough. This doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel ethical. But in many ways, it's sort of a bringing back of the theory of indulgences when it comes to the climate change crowd. What they're saying, is that there's a new original sin out there. And the original sin is enjoying a high quality of life. It's utilizing energy that's affordable and reliable. And we're going to need to change our ways, and we're going to need to tax that. And we're going to need to remove that and eradicate that to whatever level is deemed acceptable by the experts or the higher authorities of the religion or the state. In the end, as an engineer, right, as someone who loves science, the most troubling thing with regard to many of these climate policies and many of these net zero sort of plans and schemes is that it's all sort of hinging on the ability to destroy the scientific method, which has brought immeasurable benefits to society since the Enlightenment, and in its place, it's putting in and shoving in the science, which is much more of an orthodoxy, a religion that's rigid, that embraces things like scientific consensus, with the few getting to decide what the consensus is, instead of trying to strive to find ways to shatter the consensus and advance the ball and advance the state of the art forward. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed these 3 videos. We've had a lot of fun putting them together. I hope it helps sort of settle out the different ways to assess, think about not just climate change, but also the policies, perhaps more importantly, as I said at the start of video 1, those policies that might be even more of a pressing issue in many ways than climate change itself. And always be out there looking to advocate on behalf of what a rational person always goes to. That's the chemistry, the physics, the economics, the math, and science itself.